very much. The 26th of January 1838 was a particularly important day in the history of Australia. That was the very first Australia Day. But they didn't call it Australia Day then because there was no Australia. They called it Foundation Day, and it was the 50th anniversary of the founding of the colony of New South Wales on the 26th of January 1788. And the people celebrated their first Foundation Day in much the same way that people in Sydney do now. They congregated around the harbour, there were boat races, there were picnics, there were sporting events. But about 300 or 400 kilometres to the north, on exactly the same day, there was a group of about 20 soldiers under the command of a major nun who rounded up a group of about 100 Aboriginal people, herded them into a swamp and shot them one by one, every single one of them, men, women and children. Now that wasn't the only massacre that happened in the history of Australia. There were hundreds and hundreds of massacres that occurred throughout the 1800s and even into the 1900s. Now, when Australian history gets taught in schools, and I'm not just talking about my generation, but the current generation of students, they get taught about the great explorers of Australia. People like Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson. People like Hume and Hovell, Ludwig Leichhardt, Hume and Hovell. People like that who made the great discoveries, particularly in New South Wales. But what very rarely gets taught, and I'm not talking about this school, because this school is very good in this way, but in most other schools in Australia, what doesn't get taught is what inevitably happened after those great discoveries. Because within a year or two, what would happen is these discoverers would have found very fertile new lands. And the big landowners would send their sheep and their cattle into these new lands. And let me tell you that a flock of sheep or a herd of cattle can very quickly turn a waterhole into mush. So the expansion of these animals and the white population of New South Wales into these new areas inevitably resulted in conflict for resources with the local Aboriginal people who had been living there for at least 65,000 years. It looks at the moment as though it might be something like 100,000 years that they've been living in Australia. And the conflict arose because these whites with their sheep and their cattle displaced the native fauna, the native animals that the indigenous population were relying on. So inevitably the Aboriginal people would try and chase away the cows and the sheep, and there would be conflict. There would be occasional attacks, and the whites would retaliate massively. They would go out in hunting parties, 10 or 12 mounted stockmen, most of whom were convicts, would go out looking for Aboriginal people. And when they found them, they didn't care whether they were responsible for attacking the cows and the sheep or responsible for attacking the white stockmen. They would just kill them willy-nilly. They saw it as the black menace, the black problem. And the landlords, those who owned the sheep and the cattle, only encouraged them. So there are lists that have been published of hundreds and hundreds of localities all throughout Australia where these massacres occurred for more than 100 years. But there's one of those massacres that we know a lot more about than any of the others. And the reason being is that it's the only massacre in the history of Australia where whites were punished for the mass murder of Aboriginal people. And it happened later on in 1838. On the 10th of June 1838, a group of nearly a dozen armed white mounted stockmen, led by a free man called John Henry Fleming, and the others were all convicts, descended upon a group of Aboriginal people at a place called Mile Creek Station in northern New South Wales, near the current town of Inverell. They tied them all up to a long length of rope that was hitched to a saddle of a horse. They were dragged about a mile away into a gully where there was a paddock, and then they were all massacred. 28 men, women and children. Now, the manager of the property was a man by the name of William Hobbs. He was absent at the time of this massacre. When he came back to the property a few days later, he was horrified to find the remains of this massacre. And he wrote two letters, one to the governor and one to the local magistrate. And the governor, Sir George Gipps, was also horrified at what happened, and he instructed the closest magistrate to investigate. Now, in those days, magistrates did what police do today. They investigated crime as well as arrested offenders and brought them to trial. And the magistrate in this case was a very, very diligent man by the name of Captain Edward Denny Day. Denny Day was adamant that he was going to arrest as many of the perpetrators as he could. And he found 11 of the 12 of them. The one man that he wasn't able to find was the only free man, the ringleader, John Henry Fleming, because he was able to go and hide, whereas the convicts were restricted in their movements. And they were brought to Sydney for trial. Now, in those days, every murder trial was prosecuted by the Attorney General of New South Wales. And in 1838, the Attorney General was a man by the name of John Hubert Plunkett. John Plunkett deserves to be known by every Australian. He should be as famous in Australia as Martin Luther King is in America, and yet Martin Luther King is more famous in Australia than John Hubert Plunkett. And John Hubert Plunkett did an enormous number of things for New South Wales. But one of the main things that he did was he prosecuted these 11 men who had been charged with the Mile Creek massacre of those 28 Aboriginal people. Now, he knew that he had a really difficult task because it was a jury trial in the Supreme Court in Sydney, and jurors in those days had to be men who owned property. No women, no people who were just employed on a wage. They had to be property owners. So the property owners in those days had a vested interest in the prosperity of the colony. Most of the whites in those days thought that these 11 men should never have been prosecuted. They were doing something that had been done many times before. They were doing something that their land-owning, cattle-owning, sheep-owning bosses had encouraged them to do. So why should they be prosecuted? And yet John Hubert Plunkett knew that this was an opportunity to establish a very important principle of law, and that is that the law respects the life of every human being equally, no matter what their race, no matter what their religion, no matter whether they're rich or poor, landowners or convicts, or Aboriginal people. And the reason why he felt that so strongly was that he had come to Australia from Ireland. He was an Irish Catholic. And in Ireland, the Irish Catholics had been persecuted and discriminated against by their English overlords for centuries. And his family had suffered terribly over centuries. And when he came to Australia and became first Solicitor General and then Attorney General, he was determined that New South Wales was not going to go down the same path as his native island. That New South Wales would have a system of law that respected the equality of all men. And he saw this case for what it was. This was no ordinary murder case. This was an opportunity to create that principle of law. And he was determined that he was going to do that. But he realised that he had a very difficult task in front of him. So he prosecuted the trial. It was a very, very long trial. In fact, it was the longest trial of its day. It went for 2 days. Can you imagine how long a trial like that would be today? 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, who knows? And on the second day, the jury came back with their verdict, not guilty. And John Hubert Plunkett was gutted. And what he decided to do was to put the men up for retrial in relation to another one of the 28 victims. Because in those days, you could only have one victim each trial. So normally, if you failed in your first trial, that was the end of the matter. But Plunkett was determined, no, I'm going to put them up for trial again. And he suffered tremendous amount of hatred and ridicule and antagonism from the white community for putting these men up for trial again, essentially on the same evidence. Now, the second trial, there was a long wait to get to the second trial. It was 2 weeks. And in this trial, Plunkett decided to do something totally different. He decided to only prosecute the 7 against whom he had the most evidence, and to offer the other 4 immunity from prosecution, that they would not be prosecuted if they gave evidence for the prosecution. And each one of those 4 said, no, not interested. And you can probably understand why. Because those men were convicts, and they had to go back to where they were working with other convicts. Can you imagine if they'd cooperated with the hated prosecutor, what their lives would have been like later? So he had to go to retrial, but it was quite a different trial for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was that there was a different judge, and this judge was particularly sympathetic to the Aboriginal community. Anyway, this second judge, he was not going to have any fuddy-duddy business of adjourning overnight to go into the second day. He made the jury sit through the night. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, he sends the jury out to deliberate. And they deliberated for a terribly long time. 1 hour. Can you imagine? I mean, my longest trial, the jury went out and deliberated for 2 weeks and 3 days and then couldn't reach an agreement. But in those days, an hour was a long time. And they came back, and the foreman was asked to stand, and the charge was read out, and the foreman delivered his verdict, not guilty. And Plunkett couldn't believe it. But then there was a man in the back row of the jury box who put up his hand and he said, Your Honour, Judge, the foreman's just delivered the wrong verdict. So the judge did a bit of a double take and had the charge read again, and the foreman this time gave the right verdict, guilty. And those men who'd been convicted, those 7 men who'd been convicted, were all hanged. Because in those days there was only one penalty for murder, and that was death by hanging. So there was a tremendous amount of resentment for years afterwards against John Plunkett for having caused the execution of white men for the murder of black people. That's the way they saw it. And John Hubert Plunkett was responsible for numerous other really important parts of our democracy that we take for granted today. Now, John Plunkett thought he was going to have a 3rd trial of the remaining 4 men. And what he announced to the court was this. There had been an eyewitness to the massacre. An Aboriginal man who was working on the Mile Creek station was hiding in the bush watching the massacre happen. And Plunkett had spoken to him and heard his account. But in those days, an Aboriginal person was not allowed to give evidence. The reason being that to give evidence, you had to take an oath on the Bible. To take an oath on the Bible, you basically had to show that you had a belief in punishment in the life hereafter for your sins in this life. Of course, Aboriginal concepts of religion were totally different to that. But after the second trial, Plunkett thought he'd pull a Swiftie, and he announced to the court that in the 3rd trial, this young Aboriginal man He was going to have him instructed in one of the Christian religions so that in the third trial he could take an oath and give evidence. 2 weeks later, this man disappeared off the face of the earth. He was never seen again. He'd been abducted and murdered so that he couldn't give evidence. Now, it's because of the investigation of this massacre by Captain Edward Denny Day and because of the prosecution of the case by John Hubert Plunkett that we know so much about this massacre. There is a beautiful memorial to the victims of this massacre at Mile Creek Station, and I'm sure that there are some of the students at Radford here today who have been there, because Radford has had a group of students there, I think, for the last 4 or 5 years. It's a very moving ceremony on the long weekend every June where descendants of the survivors, the perpetrators and the whites who did the right thing all come together in a most magnificent act of reconciliation. It's a very moving ceremony, and I would encourage any of you at some stage to go to this ceremony. There's a very beautiful stone memorial, and there's a walk through the bush with stations that explain what happened to those people who don't know. The memorial overlooks the valley where the massacre took place. This memorial has come to represent all of the massacres throughout Australia. There are very few other memorials to massacres anywhere in Australia. There are a few, but very few. And we don't know much about the other massacres because there was no record kept of it. So this memorial is important, and our knowledge of what happened is important. And I believe that we as a nation in Australia will never reach our full maturity until we teach our children in primary schools and in high schools what inevitably happened after the discoveries of the great explorers, about how this push by the white community, the white society, the animals that went out, the pastoral interests that needed protecting, and how it had such a terrible impact on the Aboriginal community. We now have the language to be able to describe what it is that happened. The word genocide is a 20th century word. We have only had war crimes trials since 1945. There were the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War in Europe. There were the Tokyo trials after the Second World War in the Pacific. There have been war crimes trials arising out of the genocide in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, and more recently in Cambodia. So that has developed our language. And we can look back at what happened in 1838 and right throughout the 1800s, and we can call it for what it really was. It was ethnic cleansing, an attempt to get rid of a complete race of people, the Aboriginal people of Australia. If it happened today, it would result in trials for war crimes in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But of course, in 1838, they didn't have concepts like that. And yet John Hubert Plunkett, he knew that that was no ordinary murder trial. And we have him to thank for having conducted these 2 trials so successfully. Did the trials stop the massacres? No. Just as we can look at, say, the Nuremberg trials and say that didn't stop massacres in various parts of the world. Was it important? Yes. It's a beacon of light in Australia's history. And I think that it deserves to be taught to our children. Thank you very much.